the beginning. So welcome everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here today. It's great that we've had such good attendance. My name is Holly Minicchiello, as Ian introduced me. I'm an HR consultant as part of a company called the HR department. We very much do what it says on the tin. We are expert HR advisors who support a number of businesses and organisations across the UK. So today's training session. So to make the most out of today's training, today is about you guys. We want you to get as much as you possibly can out of this session. There is no such thing as a stupid question. Believe me, you can ask anything you want as part of the HR remit, even if it seems really small. Sometimes the small things can be some of the most important things. You get questions around holiday, sickness, the sort of things that you feel like, oh, I really should know this. Please don't feel afraid to ask those questions as we go through the session. Just while I'm running through this presentation, if I can ask everyone to mute their microphones, I can see a lot of people have already done this already, just to make sure there's no sound interference while we're going through the session. We will be fielding questions at the end, so there may be opportunity to unmute mics there if you want to raise a conversation over video. And as part of confidentiality, when you're asking these questions, do try and keep things a little bit vague, just to make sure that we're protecting the confidentiality of anyone if there are any specific questions you want to ask. If there is something more nuanced or related to a particular situation, we can discuss that after the session. We're going to go through things from the start of employment right at the very beginning through to the end. So the very first thing we're looking at here is recruitment. So first stage, crucial, is planning. Now this can apply to any position you're hiring for. So that could be voluntary, it could be a contract of employment where you're engaging someone in permanent or fixed term engagements, or it could be just a worker or a contractor. So planning is crucial to make sure that you are getting exactly the right team members for your organisation. So having a proper think about what is needed, what sort of roles you actually genuinely need in the business, and consulting with key stakeholders within the business to make sure that everyone is on board when you're getting someone in. Do you need someone in an administrative tongue-tied already, darn, this session is recorded, in an administrative position, or do you need someone a little bit more technical, with a little bit more expertise? So doing that initial planning can be vital. As part of that, nailing down the specifics of the role. So drafting a job description or role description to make sure that everyone is completely transparent on what you need from the person and what that person should be bringing to the role as well. When you're looking to attract someone, you probably have quite a few pools of candidates that you know where you can get them from, some certain channels, people that you've got contacts with who'll be able to put you in touch with people who'll be able to join those roles. But looking at other opportunities outside of what you normally source through can be really, really vital. Social media has become a massive part of recruitment these days. LinkedIn profiles or Facebook advertisements can reach a very wide number of people, and particularly where you've got a role that doesn't necessarily need to be on site, that can be fantastic for looking at a much wider pool of candidates rather than maybe the local area that you would normally be sourcing from. Of course, you can still target through social media advertising to make sure that you're getting people in the area if that's the sort of role that you're applying for, where they need to be physically present, but just expanding what you're looking for and the ways in which you're hiring can be wonderful for getting the right people in your organization. When you're sifting and you're looking at your selection methods, you'll need to sorting through all of the applications. So the more efficient you can be with that process, the better. How are you doing it? How are you looking through all of those profiles? Are you getting someone to look through all the information and filter them based on, say, education or experience, or even location, where we just talked about people who need to be on site? So making sure that you've got the right sifting tools in place. An Excel spreadsheet can be an excellent basic tool that you can have in place just to record those things in columns and use that as a tool. So if you are looking to reject candidates, you are looking to reach out and have those interviews with people, you've got a great tool. If someone comes back to you and says, why didn't I make it through that sifting process, you can say, well, actually you didn't have the skills required, or you weren't in the right location, and make sure that you're fully covered should there be any challenges on that. What not to do while recruiting. The biggest risk you can encounter when you're looking to recruit someone is by far discrimination. It might not be something that you're intentionally doing, or something. Well, you'd really hope that it's not something you're intentionally doing, but it's one of the pitfalls that can really trip people up during the recruitment process. We'll talk about discrimination a little bit in the next slide. But apart from discrimination, you also need to be aware of making sure that you're keeping all the records of the recruitment process. So make sure you're storing CVs in the right place, make sure you're going back to candidates, responding to them. Don't leave people hanging. If you can, just send a holding email to people if you're not looking to go through with them, just to say, you know, this isn't, when we're not going to pursue this any further. It's always good to do that, to make sure that you're not leaving people hanging, you're not having people chasing you, and you're leaving a good experience for people who are going through the process, who might want to apply for positions again in the future if they're unsuccessful. When you're looking to make the offer, you found that perfect person for the role, make sure you have all the details in place and before making that offer, and ensure that anything you say when you're making the offer is also captured in writing. Try not to make any promises during that offer session that you can't actually uphold in the position itself, again, be it voluntary or a permanent recruitment opportunity, and make sure that when the offer is made, all details are put in place when you're communicating that to people. But we will cover contracts and offers slightly later in the training. So briefly mention the Discrimination and Equality Act. So this is governed by the Equality Act of 2006, although it was updated in 2010. And this outlines the requirements that all organisations, particularly employers, should abide by when they're looking to engage people in the business. So there are a number of protected characteristics that you need to be aware of. So we've got age, race, religion, belief, sex, disability, pregnancy and maternity, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and marriage and civil partnership. Now, the key thing is that if you are making a decision that may affect a person, be it through recruitment, be it in the course of their employment with you or their engagement with you, you cannot make a decision that infringes on those protected characteristics unreasonably. So ways in which discrimination shows itself are through direct and indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination is usually related to a characteristic that the person has themselves. So, for example, if you're looking to hire for a job and you refuse to hire someone because you think that they're too old for the job, that could be seen as age discrimination. Indirect discrimination looks at where there are rules or arrangements in place that would prevent someone from achieving something or getting a role which relate to a protected characteristic. So as an example of this, if we go for age again, if someone has applied for a role and you put in the role description, must have 10 years experience. That can isolate quite a few people as part of the process because that's quite a lot of experience to have in the role. So younger candidates wouldn't necessarily be able to apply for that, even where the role may allow for them to do so. So being very careful, touching on recruitment again, that when you are drafting advertisements or looking out in the market or talking to people, making sure that you're not saying anything that can't be justified. So if you do need 10 years experience, why do you need those 10 years experience in the role? Less favourable treatment is looking at someone if they're treated in a less favourable way in comparison to a comparator, the next point. So a comparator is someone who is in the same or similar enough situation as the person who is being discriminated against. So again, another example, you've got two people who are up for promotion. One is a woman, one is a man. The woman is overlooked for the promotion and the man isn't, and he is offered that promotion. There doesn't appear to be any other reasons. They've got exactly the same tenure, the same experience, the same qualifications, but the man was offered it over the woman. So this is where the less favourable treatment comes in. It's then trying to say, why was the woman overlooked for promotion? Why was the man chosen in favour of that, which would be discrimination on the basis of sex? So just being very conscious of those things when you go through any sort of recruitment process throughout the HR experience, just making sure that you just have a reflect, make sure on anything you're drafting, anything you're communicating, make sure that it isn't potentially discriminating against someone either directly or indirectly. Taking a look at personnel files, so moving on to the more the fun administrative part of HR. So why do we have personnel files and where do we have personnel files? So these are crucial. to make sure that you're meeting your obligations as either an employer or a person who's engaging a volunteer or worker. And it lets you keep track of all aspects of the engagement life cycle. So, for example, you can have records on people's start dates, their pay, things like their medical records, if you have things like medical questionnaires before someone joins. So making sure you've got a log of all of that information to make sure that you are fully up to speed on everything, and you're not, again, discriminating or putting someone at a disadvantage based on their information, and you have it all logged so you can report back to it later on in the employment lifecycle if necessary. Where is quite a crucial one. You need to make sure that documents are stored in a safe location. So that could be a locked filing cabinet that only you or the relevant people in the organization have access to, or it could be a password protected file on a computer or a password protected account on a computer, but making sure that you've got that fully secured. When you're looking to retain documents, most employment documents you'd want to retain for no more than 6 years. Would recommend keeping them around for that long. You can get things like employment tribunals or claims come up in the future. So having those records to look back on, particularly if you're keeping good audit records, can be invaluable if someone tries to challenge any decision made during their engagement with you. In terms of candidate data, looking back on recruitment, you wouldn't want to keep any candidate data such as CVs or anything similar for any more than 6 months, mainly because you wouldn't really have a reason to retain any of that unless they've become an employee, in which case their data would move over to the 6-year retention period that I just mentioned. Access, we have seen in some organizations that files are stored on, as I mentioned, the locked access portal, like an account on a laptop or a computer, where other people can have access to it, or they've left their password saved on the laptop. Please don't do this. It puts people's data at risk, and some of you may be aware of the General Data Protection Regulation, a rather large piece of legislation that came in over the last few years. This means that there are far more protections in place for people's data. So making sure that it's stored securely and safely, and that only the relevant people have access to it, is really, really important. As part of the GDPR legislation that came in, as part of the GDPR legislation that came in, one thing that people can do is they can make a data subject access request. Now, this was something that was already in place, but the timelines have changed slightly on how long it takes to respond to that. Now, a data subject access request is a formal request that is made by an employee or a person who is working with you to provide information in a certain area. So somebody might write to you and say, I want to see all data or emails that you've sent containing my name over the past year, and you'll be given a window of time in which you have to respond to that and provide all the information. If you do get a data subject access request, make sure you provide everything you can if that request has been made. So if they say any communication, you need to be careful about what sort of methods of communication have been used. So for example, some organizations use Slack, some use Teams. We're using Teams today to have this meeting, and those can contain conversations or chats which include the person's name. So if anyone does make a request for data, make sure that you're checking all of those channels, make sure that you're reporting all of that data and handing it over as you're required to do so. Although fingers crossed you won't be getting too many data subject access requests, because they are very lengthy processes. So moving on to the documentation that will be stored, we've got the offer of employment or volunteer agreement. So before an offer of employment is made, one of the biggest things you need to make sure is that you have got evidence of a person's right to work in the UK. This is a crucial thing. There are some changes coming in April, which cover the right to work checks so that they govern both UK and international employees or volunteers that are working in your organisation. Make sure you have an audit trail of any right to work documentation you have. If it's someone who's working remotely, you can always do a check where you have them send a scan of their identification, their visa, their passport, and then you can have them on a video call where they hold up their passport or ID, and you can check that the scan that you've got there matches the person that's on the video call with you. Just to make sure that is the correct person. We have had some organisations where that check wasn't done and a very different person turned up to work the next day. So make sure you're on top of that before anyone starts employment. When looking at references, as part of that onboarding, you will need to ask people for references as when they join. Now, can you provide a negative reference? No, you can't provide a negative reference for someone. You can provide a factual reference stating things like their start date, what position they were employed in, and their leaving date, but you cannot provide a negative reference. The main reason for this is if the person was then unable to get the job. For example, if you're doing a reference check and you get a reference from someone and they're like, oh, they were the worst person ever, they never turned up to work on time, they were always sick, they were always off late. Yeah, getting all those sorts of comments. If you then refuse them the position, that person who didn't get the job could then challenge their former employer to say, you have now prevented me from getting a job. So be very careful when providing any sort of references. And if you are gathering references, make sure that you're saving them to evidence if a candidate is being rejected. Taking up the references, make sure they're done in a timely manner. Give people time to come back to you with those bits of reference information so that you're all prepared for day one. And health checks. So some positions, you will not need to do a health check. If you've got an administration assistant, you probably won't need to do a health check on them to make sure they're fit and proper for their role. But if you've got someone coming in a slightly more physical role, like a porter or something more maintenance related, it may be necessary to do a medical check. So again, make sure that's done before they join the organisation. When should an employee be given their contract? The latest an employee can be given a contract of employment is day one. They cannot be given it any later. There used to be a rule in place where it could be up to 8 weeks. That has now gone. It has to be in place by day one, so they know exactly what terms they are being engaged under. If someone doesn't sign their contract, but they continue to work, they're still turning up to work, they just haven't provided the signed version, there is an implication that they are working under those terms. So those terms would still apply to them, but do try and chase them to get a signed version of the contract because you'd want that for audit purposes. But the contract that they've been issued would be the contract they are working under, regardless of whether or not it's signed. Can it be changed? You can change a contract of employment. You just need to make sure that you are providing notice of the change and you are consulting with people when you make that change. If it's something positive, say you want to give someone more holiday entitlement, you're not likely to get many challenges from people as part of a consultation period to say, I don't want any more holiday. I haven't heard that one yet, but there's still time. If it's a more negative change, say you're having to remove a benefit or change working hours, you need to make sure there is a consultation period of at least 30 days. That's a reasonable length of time to make sure that they accept the change and get them to sign something to confirm that they accept that change. Volunteer agreements are a lot shorter than a contract of employment, and they generally only govern the basic terms of the engagement. So things like location, what the role is, some health and safety, just to cover off the necessary parts of what sort of health and safety rules they'll be under, contact for if they have any problems during their employment, data protection and confidentiality. So you wouldn't want much more than that in a volunteer agreement, mainly because of this slide, because there are some areas that you need to be careful of when engaging volunteers. So the main points of someone being a volunteer in an organisation, there cannot be any financial rewards or benefits in kind for the work that they do. They don't have to turn up to work if they don't want to, so they can be very flexible about when they're working. They are genuinely volunteering their time, and they cannot be dismissed, sued for breach of contract, or have payment or reward withheld if they fail to do the work they perform. So calling them a volunteer doesn't necessarily mean that they're a volunteer, or calling them an unpaid worker doesn't mean that they're unpaid. The biggest things you have to be careful to make sure that they are genuinely a volunteer are those 3 points just there, and also making sure that you're not promising anything to them. If you have someone coming on board and you say, if you come on board as a volunteer, I promise you, we'll definitely get you on a contract of employment, we'll get you hired. If you say that to someone, that can mean that they are required to be paid minimum wage as part of their role with you, because they've been given a promise of remuneration later on down the line. So you have to be very careful about what's promised to volunteers. They should be genuinely coming in just to engage in some casual work to support the organisation, something that they are interested in doing, but without that promise of remuneration later. They can be given expenses. but they should be genuinely out-of-pocket expenses. So again, you have to be careful not to give them any more, to say, here's £50 for a very generous lunch, because that could be considered as pay. And if they're being paid, then you have to make sure that you're complying with minimum wage rules. So if they genuinely lost money getting to a site or doing some work with you, and they can evidence it with receipts or something similar, great, you can expense that and they're still a volunteer. If you're paying them slightly more, just be careful, because that could lead to you needing to pay them minimum wage as part of their engagement with you. So you've got the people in, you've gone through the recruitment process, you've got the documentation in. So inducting people as they join the company. The biggest thing, the most vital point, is making sure that you are transparent on the culture, values, and the rules in the organization. You want them to have a really good impression of what you're doing, but you want them to understand what you're trying to do as part of their work with you. Lots of the challenges we see in organizations recently have been about people being onboarded, particularly where a lot of things have been remote, distant, doing it over Teams or Zoom, where they haven't really got the values or an understanding of what's required of them as part of their role. So making sure that that's fully transparent on day one, so that they know what you expect from them, and there's a good amount of understanding there, so there's no issues later on down the line where they're not doing something that you would expect them to be doing. An induction checklist and plan can be really, really helpful, because it allows you to structure the onboarding process with the person in a meaningful way. So, for example, who are they meeting? Do they need to do some IT onboarding? Do they need to come in for a bit to have a laptop set up or a computer? Or do they need to have any sort of orientation so they've got an idea of what's necessary? And what will that look like? What's the time scale for that? Is it a week, 2 weeks? Having that laid out can be really, really helpful. Health and safety, that induction is particularly important where you've got someone that's coming physically on site to do work for you, making sure you're covering that fully to make sure there are no risks to them. They are fully aware of the obligations on their part in terms of maintaining a safe working environment. Don't overload them. Don't try and give them too much at once. Try and ease them into the organisation. Give them some little tasks to do at the beginning so they get a feel for what they're after. You can keep a good monitor on the work that they're putting out. And again, you're making sure that if there are any issues, you're nipping them in the bud nice and early on, and there aren't any concerns there later on down the line. Probationary periods, you'll need to check, this will be for employees, make sure that you check the contracts of employment for these people to see how long their probationary period is, and make sure that you have regular check-ins and reviews with people as part of that. Usually notice is shorter during a probationary period, so you tend to be able to let people go with a shorter amount of notice, which can be very helpful, but just making sure that you're keeping a track of their performance throughout that process. You've got those written records, those meetings, those catch-ups, so that if worst comes to the worst and you do need to consider potentially terminating someone's employment and they failed their probation, you've got all of that written out and you followed a good process to say why something isn't working out as part of their engagement with you. So I've got a few bits here on absence. So the two main bits of absence that you tend to see are holidays and sickness. So holiday entitlement would be outlined in someone's contract of employment. Make sure that you've got a record of that to make sure that you know exactly how much leave someone is taking. In terms of the working time regulations, the WTR I've noted on point 2, all employees have to make sure that they're taking at least 28 days annual leave a year, which is the statutory minimum amount. Some people might be given more, some people might have more generous holiday amounts, but you need to make sure that all employees are taking at least 28 days, including bank holidays. It's a lot easier if they have the bank holidays off anyway. It means that you don't have to chase up on more days to make sure they're booking them off. It will be prorated if they're a part-timer, so their holiday entitlement will be dependent on how many hours they work in comparison to a full-time person. You also might have people on 0 hours contracts where their holidays are calculated based on the shifts worked or the hours worked, as opposed to just general accrual as they go on through their employment. But again, make sure that you're checking contracts of employment for that particular aspect. Where someone is on long-term sickness absence or LTA, they will continue to accrue holiday. This is something that we've seen trip up a few people in the past. If someone is off for, say, a month, 2 months, they've got a long-term serious condition, they will continue to accrue leave while they're an employee. So in one organisation we worked with, we had an employee that had been off for 4 years and they hadn't done anything with the holiday, and that person was then owed 4 years worth of holiday because the employer had never done anything about paying it out or giving them the opportunity to have that holiday, even though they were off sick throughout the entirety of those 4 years. So make sure you're keeping a good log of any sickness, absence, holiday accrual there. And on termination, if someone has accrued holiday and they haven't taken it before their last day, make sure that this is paid to them, because it's a contractual entitlement that they'll be paid for any holiday that they have accrued but not taken once they have left. In terms of sickness, short-term sickness, make sure you keep records and make sure you're keeping in touch with the person who's off sick. If it's a day or 2 days, touch base with them in the morning to make sure that they're doing okay, have an idea of when they'll be looking to return to work. This can include people who are volunteers as well as employees if they're expected to come in, but make sure that you're keeping up that communication and checking in on them to make sure they're okay. When they come back, make sure that they complete a self-certification form, or where they've been off for slightly longer, make sure that they provide a doctor's note for their absence. So you've got a record of exactly why they were off sick. Someone just saying, I felt unwell, isn't very helpful when you're looking at their well-being in the long term, particularly where there's lots of little bits of absences. If someone keeps saying, oh, I'm just unwell, you can get kind of concerned. It's like, well, what's going on? Why is someone being sick all the time? All we're getting is they're unwell. Whereas if they're saying things like, I've got headaches, and you've got lots of evidence to say that they've had lots of time off, short absences for headaches, it might be worth a slightly more in-depth conversation with them about their well-being to say, we're seeing a bit of a trend here to do with your health, and we want to make sure everything's okay. Similarly, keeping a track of their sickness absence to make sure if they very suspiciously keep taking Mondays off after they've been out for the weekend, or they keep taking Fridays off and going on long weekends, just noticing those trends to make sure if you do need to pick anything up with them, this is addressed in a timely manner rather than letting it drag on. SSP, so the current rate for SSP is £96.35 per week, and that is payable after 3 qualifying days of sickness absence. So they have 3 days off, and then on the 4th day they start getting paid SSP. At the moment, if someone's off with COVID, SSP kicks in from day 1. That is going to change as of the 17th of March. So currently up to the 17th of March, if you are off sick and you're only entitled to SSP, you will get SSP day 1. From the 17th of March, that will be the same as normal sickness absence, and then SSP will only be payable on the 4th day of sickness absence. Long-term absence, touched on this briefly earlier, but make sure communication is being maintained with the person even when they're out of the business for a long time. It might be that you touch base with them slightly more infrequently. You don't want to be in touch with someone every single day if they're off for, say, 2 months, but it might be worth having touch points with them to say, let's meet every week or every 2 weeks, or just have a conversation to make sure everything's okay with you and see if there's any update on you coming back to work. In terms of disability, someone might need to take reasonable time off to treat the disability or have appointments related to their disability. Where they're coming back into the business, just make sure that if there are any reasonable adjustments the business can make to support them in coming back into work. So it could be later start times to ensure they're not on a very busy bus or tube or car journey where this might delay them getting into work, giving them that, or it could be something as simple as giving them a chair to sit on if they're usually in a role that requires them to stand a lot, just giving them the opportunity to have more regular rest breaks. You don't have to do anything too outrageous, but as support, you just need to be as supportive as you possibly can and as you reasonably can. We don't expect everyone to be forking out lots of money where it will be difficult to accommodate a disability otherwise, but just making sure that you're taking the time to support people and you're investing in them where it is reasonable to do so. Other types of leave, we've got family friendly policies. Now I could talk for a very, very long time about all of these things, so this is going to be a very much a whistle-stop tour of family friendly policies. The first 3, maternity, paternity and shared parental leave, the entitlement to be paid for all of these kicks in after 6 months service. That's when you are entitled to have the statutory payments of statutory maternity, statutory paternity, and statutory shared parental pay. Paternity leave is sort of the odd one out in this little grouping, as you don't have the entitlement to take it or be paid for it until you have those 6 months service. If someone's pregnant before 6 months service has been completed, then they would be entitled to something called maternity allowance, and that can be accessed through the government. And as part of that, there's a form that they can complete and that you'll have to complete to confirm they wouldn't be eligible for that. So the key thing is, once they've had 6 months service, they should be entitled to the majority of statutory payments. But again, double check with contracts, make sure that that's all in line with the policies that you've got in place in your organisations. Antenatal appointments are paid for the mother, so they can take reasonable paid time off to attend antenatal appointments. For fathers or partners of people who are having a baby, this can be unpaid time off. Parental leave and time off for dependent emergencies is unpaid time off as a general rule for people. The difference between these two, time off for dependent emergencies, is genuinely, my daughter is really sick, I can't possibly get in, I need to look after her today, I can't come in. They then have to take emergency dependent leave. Parental leave is much more long term. So say you've got a child and you're looking to look at schools for them, or like school applications, going to tour the schools in the catchment area, you need to book off time to be able to go around and look at those schools. That would be parental leave, and you get a certain amount of leave to take up to the child's 18th birthday, and that leave carries over from employer to employer. So always make sure you keep a good record of parental leave if this is being taken, because it can be very important, because I can't remember the exact amount right now, which is a terrible failing, but I believe it is a few weeks that they get off throughout the course. I think it's 4 weeks, but it has to be taken over the course of the 18 years of the child's early years. Flexible working, slightly different to the rest of these points, where this is a request that can be made after 6 months service. This ties into the family friendly aspects, where someone's looking to start a family, they may start to look at changing their working arrangements. They may want to move to part-time working arrangements or start work later in the day to make sure they can make the school run. If someone does want to make a flexible working request, if they've got a certain amount of service, which is the 6 months, they can put a formal request in writing for you to consider. If you did want to reject that request, then there'd have to be a very specific reason for you doing so, which have to relate to the way in which you operate the organisation. So could it be that you can't meet customer or client demands? Is it because it will cost too much to cover the person not being at work because of the flexible working request? So you can also accept it. I realise that quite a lot of the points here are slightly negative, but if you did want to accept it, absolutely fine. Make sure that it is done in writing. Make sure that you have all the details of the working arrangements lined out, including the new working hours, new working days, new hours, if they're structured. And if you are rejecting it, making sure that you're covering your bases in terms of why that rejection has taken place. A slightly down one is the disciplinary and grievance processes. The biggest part of a disciplinary and a grievance process is an audit trail. It is essential that every stage of a disciplinary or a grievance is written out and saved and stored securely, so that you can follow a fair process should this ever be challenged in future. So disciplinary and grievances in the first stages take a very similar format. So to start with, if someone raises a grievance, or if you need to bring them in for a disciplinary meeting, they need to be notified in writing of this. So in terms of a disciplinary, this would be including the information in terms of the alleged misconduct. So what have they done wrong? What is allegedly happened? So, for example, someone says, we're accusing you of stealing something. You have to say in this letter, the allegation is that you have stolen something from us. And as part of that, you also need to make sure that you are saying exactly when this happened, who was witness to that. You're providing as much detail and as much transparency as possible. For a grievance, when you're notifying them in writing, it will be to confirm that you are meeting with them to hear their grievance in person. So you're outlining exactly what the points of their grievance are. So, for example, if they believe they've had a conflict with another member of staff, it will be the alleged conflict with that person in that letter. In the letter, you need to outline the possible consequences. This applies more so to disciplinary than it does to grievance. But it's important to make sure that you're outlining exactly what those sanctions could be. So, for example, where you've got someone who is subject to a disciplinary, is it so serious that that merits a final written warning? Is it so serious that this could be gross misconduct? Where these things can affect their employment, it is very important to make sure that this is explained to them in writing prior to them going into the meeting so that they know what to prepare for. When you're writing to them, make sure you provide copies of any written evidence, including the witness statements. So for a grievance, you'd want to attach any details on any statements made by people if they've collated evidence prior to making their grievance complaint with you. Make sure that you've got that all collated and available to the employee as part of that process. For disciplinaries, you can also reference things like if you have CCTV that covers, say, a potential theft. Telling them that this exists, it might be quite difficult to send them the CCTV footage, particularly if it's in an awkward format, but making sure that they are aware that this exists, and if they do want to see it prior to the meeting, giving them the opportunity to do so. In the letter, detailing the date, time, venue and chair of the meeting, the chair being one of the more crucial things, because we have seen in some grievance and disciplinary meetings people saying, well, I refuse to attend that meeting because I don't like them and I don't think they're going to hold a fair process. So you can get challenges like that in disciplinary and grievance meetings. So making sure that they are fully aware of who will be part of this process. Also, if you've got a note taker attending, make sure to put their details in there as well. With formal disciplinary processes and with grievance processes, everyone has the right to be accompanied. So usual accompaniments will be a trade union representative or a colleague. Sometimes you can be flexible, particularly with grievance processes. You may want to allow them to bring someone like a family member or a friend along to that meeting. Be careful if you wanted to extend that to things such as disciplinary, because you're always going to have someone who's got an uncle who works in HR, and they will bring that uncle from HR to that meeting, and they will be challenging. If they wanted to have someone who's got some expertise in the area that they're being challenged on, a trade union representative would be excellent at that particular point, and they do have the right to bring a trade union representative. So if someone says they are bringing someone, you are within your rights to ask to say, who are you bringing? Could you give me more details on who that is, to make sure that they'll be suitable to attend with them. You also need to make sure that you're giving them reasonable notice of the meeting. So we usually say around 3 days to make sure that they've got adequate time to prepare any sort of rebuttal, if they need to gather evidence of their own as part of the process, and to make sure that the person that's going to be accompanying them is available to join them in that meeting with them. And then throughout that process, you just need to make sure that you are documenting everything. So the note taker I mentioned earlier is a particularly crucial part of this. Make sure that you're taking notes, not necessarily word for word, because that would be quite the exercise to try and get it verbatim, but getting as many notes on what is discussed as possible, because that will form part of any response that you give to someone. Then we've got leaving employment. So there are a few ways people leave the business, one of which is resignations. Any resignations should be handled sensitively. As part of that, it may be someone coming up to you and saying, you know, I'm looking to leave the business. If they do confirm something verbally with you, make sure that you ask them to confirm it in writing with you as well. This is very important because it will form part of the response that you give to them when accepting the resignation. When they put it in writing, look out for if they've given you notice. This might be an important conversation to have. Some people are aware of how much notice they owe the business, others may not be. So some people will just put in their resignation letter, I'm leaving, great working with you. And then you can go back and say, thank you for your resignation. As part of your contract of employment, you are required to work 1 week's notice. Therefore, your last day of employment will be a week from today. So make sure that you've got that particular part ticked off. With resignations as well, it's a good chance for some people to put in some troublesome wording. So always keep an eye out for things like, I've had no other choice but to resign, or I don't feel like I'm welcome here, or anything else that might point to them being disgruntled in the exit process. So if that happens, what we'd always suggest is talking to the employee, or if you just wanted to accept the resignation, putting within that resignation letter, I note within your resignation that you mentioned that you weren't particularly happy, or that you feel that you had no other choice. And I'd really like to explore that with you and have a chat with you about that. Because what you want to do is make sure you're heading off any risk that if they're leaving, they might raise a claim or an ACAS claim against you, or potentially a tribunal claim. So making sure that you can be seen as reasonable because you've acknowledged that there's something wrong there and you were acting upon it to make sure that you were giving them the opportunity to state their case if there were any concerns. Then we've got another thing on resignations, apologies, is that someone can ask to retract their resignation. They could hand it in, you could accept it, and they could say, actually, I don't want to resign anymore. I want to stay with the business. The business is under no obligation, or the organisation is under no obligation to accept a retraction of someone's resignation. So you can opt to, if you'd like to, say, no, we're actually going to hold to the acceptance of resignation, and as per the letter that we sent you, your last working day will be this. So you're under no obligation to accept a retraction. If you would like them to stay in the business, if they're a really good worker employee and you're actually like, yes, we'd love you to stay, you can of course say that's absolutely fine, put it in writing that you've accepted the retraction and they'll continue working, but just be aware that you aren't under any obligation to do that. Dismissal is the slightly worse version of someone leaving the business unwillingly. As we covered before, it should always be communicated to the person in writing, particularly where something is, say, a gross misconduct dismissal. They aren't entitled to notice if it is a gross misconduct dismissal, so they will be paid up to the last working day that they were with you and nothing else. If it's any other type of dismissal, so for example, if you dismiss them in a reduced process, say they've got less than 2 years service or they're within their probationary period, you can instead inform them that they've been dismissed as part of that process and they can be paid in lieu of their notice period. So making sure that if there are any pay obligations or any accrued holiday or anything similar, that's all outlined in writing to them. We touched on reference requests earlier. But if you are giving a reference for someone who is leaving, make sure that you're factual with any information that you're providing. Make sure you're clear with any information you're giving. You can give a positive reference. You could give a glowing reference to someone who's been a fantastic asset to the organisation. You know, you can say how wonderful they are. Some organisations, when they're looking to hire someone, they'll give you a structure to fill out. They'll say things like, what would they like to work with? We've seen some that say, how suitable do you think they'd be for the role that they've applied for? You don't have to fill those in, but if you feel that you have positive contributions to make to that, definitely do. It can be a really positive thing for someone to, when they're moving into a new business. It gives them a good impression of you as well if they ever have sight of that particular document. But again, just make sure, don't give negative references. If there is something negative that's happened, say you dismiss them under not very cheerful terms, don't put any detail of that into the letter. If someone asks for detail on that for the new hiring organisation, don't provide that information because it can come back to bite you if the employee comes back to say, well, you prevented me from getting a position and now I'm going to come after you for loss of wages because you prevented me from doing that. So if it is a negative leaving, make sure that it's just factual: start date, leave date, position they were hired in. You don't have to say anything further than that. Exit interviews can be really helpful where you've got people leaving through resignation, or actually it would just be resignation, where they're leaving the company, because it can help you understand why they're leaving. Some people will be leaving because there's better opportunities elsewhere, or they feel that they can get better career progression elsewhere. But it's really helpful to collate that information, because what it can help you do is it can help you act on why people are leaving, particularly in places where there's quite a high level of attrition, where you've got quite a few people leaving. You can look at that data and say, okay, so for example, it might be that people have a problem with pay. They're not particularly happy with the wages we're offering. Can I act on that? Can I offer people more pay? And if you can't because of the limits on the banding that you've got, Could it be that there are other benefits or other ways that you can improve morale within the business? So things like having away days with the staff, or offering enhanced holiday or similar things. So it can be used as a really positive way of managing and limiting attrition where it's not necessary. Again, there'll always be people who will look for other opportunities elsewhere, but for those who could stay, for the ones who could actually continue to contribute to the business, how can we help keep them in the business, and how can we retain them, and what would that look like from the perspective of people who are actually still leaving? And that was a very whistle-stop tour through the basics of HR. So I will stop sharing my screen now once I work out how technology